Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Mr. Harry Groce. Hello, Harry. Now, Harry works with me night and day on research at the Institute, and tonight we're going to talk about our book that we've produced recently, the two of us. And Harry did yeoman's work in helping with the book. And the book is about the coronavirus and what ideas can be extracted from how the world has responded to this terrible epidemic. Is that a fair statement, Harry?
I think so. Yes, sir.
Now, we can bounce the basketball around a bit, but we have some central points, and one of them involves human arrogance. Now, you're a student of human arrogance, are you not, Harry? You've observed a lot of arrogance in your
I have
limited time on Earth from different quarters. I don't know where you might have observed that, but wherever that's been. But humans are really pretty cocky about their role on the Earth. Is that right? And
they are. We tend to believe ourselves invincible until we're proven not to be.
And there are biblical references to the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and one of those is plague. Is that right? We've certainly seen a lot of plagues over the decades, and episodically they happen and almost destroy whole nations, cultures, and we've assumed that modern science and medicine can protect us from these epidemics. Is there something, maybe I'll throw you a football a little bit. Maybe you can discuss what made the coronavirus almost an inevitability in our present world. Yeah. Why did that happen?
I think there's a couple factors. There's an increasing human population that just means more opportunities for attack, more opportunities for spread, and because of the way population increases work, that means that human zones of habitation have expanded into previously unoccupied, uninhabited zones that are filled with all kinds of different animals. And when that happens, when you start getting new contact between animal species and humans, you often get jumps of various pathogens. Most of the time it's a dud, but sometimes you get something like we got with SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19.
And we have these 8 billion people are at risk moving around. And one of the issues in the past is when epidemics of one sort or another happened, it took a long time for the pathogen to go from country to country. I think about the Black Death, which decimated Europe in the 14th century, but it actually took several years before it reached the extremities of Europe. Now we have rapid air transportation, and so a person that's contaminated in Shanghai can be in North America in easily 24 hours, and that's a persisting world danger, is it not?
Yes. Yeah. 1,000 years ago, a pathogen would take, at least months to travel from country to country, sometimes years, and then because transport was so slow, oftentimes it would kind of burn itself out in this kind of slow, inexorable wave that would go across the area. But now, like you said, we can have someone, fly from Shanghai to LA within less than 24 hours, which would be before someone freshly infected might even be showing symptoms, might even know that they're sick. And so instead of having these slow waves that kind of burn through areas over time, you get rapid infections that spread very quickly that become very difficult to contain if they're not caught almost immediately.
Well, now, Harry, it is not impossible, indeed likely, that the world is going to confront epidemics such as this in the future.
Oh, yes.
And what kind of score would we'll pretend we're going to grade humanity's response to this pan-epidemic? How well do we think our species has done in stopping the epidemic or responding to it?
I'd give us a solid C at best.
That's pretty charitable.
I'd say at best, and it depends on when in the pandemic you're talking. I think early on we did a little bit better. We reacted very quickly. We worked very closely along multilateral, multinational lines to secure international agreements on things. But once it really began to impinge upon economic success, these agreements fell apart pretty quickly, and it became every man for himself pretty quickly.
Well, Harry, I think the C is pretty charitable. I believe you're a product of great inflation. Is that right? As a young man, if you
No.
see, in my day, a C was a respectable grade. Not so much these days. And you're not a product of great inflation.
No.
Very
No.
tough grading. Hard to get a C. Okay. Well, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, where I've observed a little great inflation. Well, that aside. I would be not as charitable from our observations about how the world's responded, and particularly the cost with the control arrangements that were put there. So, and there's been a lot of discussion about that, what to do when this strange phenomena struck the earth, struck our country, and it's turned into a political story, but you have any comments about how the U.S. government responded, and indeed governments in general, to this pan-epidemic on our shores? Any comments?
Well, I think the U.S. in particular, the U.K. also, I think we're very guilty of not taking it seriously enough, quickly enough. By the time we actually began to do something, it was already endemic within our population. And so it kind of meant that every bit of the lockdowns that we did, the 2-week lockdown that ended up turning into almost 2 years of stuff, was almost wasted because we missed that golden hour of trying to stop contamination. We never took testing seriously. We still don't take testing seriously, which means we have no idea how the virus is actually behaving in the population.
It's pretty endemic now. I mean, is it not? I mean,
yes.
So in looking at how society responded to this, at least our book, we make the case a little bit about the risk-benefit ratios, the cost involved in different kinds of control mechanisms might not have appropriately been considered by decision makers. And indeed, a lot of the decisions were placed in the hands of epidemiologists who I think we could say this, were focused on controlling the epidemic. That was the number one issue on their agenda. And the societal cost involved mental illness, violence, war, distress, deferred cancer care. It was really a very expensive control mechanism, and indeed, the impact of the virus on our country and the world, and the control mechanisms that have been employed are we're still feeling that, are we not? We still have the sequelae of economic issues. We have the great amount of money that was helicoptered everywhere, the whole way to keep the home fires burning. There's a lot of inflation referable to that, a lot of issues going on, and it's a difficult problem to deal with. I slightly criticize the U.S. on this, slightly, maybe a little more so, which is fine. But what do you think about China? I know initially in our book, this was written some time ago, we praised the Chinese control mechanisms and said, well, maybe if you're a totalitarian country, you're competing sort of the free American style, the exceptionalism of the U.S. Compared with this traditional style in the East and in China. Maybe the Chinese had some advantages. So has that proved to be the case? Can you comment on their control mechanisms?
Well, I think that totalitarian governments like China are starting from a better position. They have a little more freedom to enact more heavy-handed policies, but I think that ultimately it is proving that they are. What we actually ended up arguing in the book was that eventually there was going to be a price to pay. That zero COVID was working for them at the time, but as recent outbreaks in Shanghai and Beijing have shown, that eventually they had to open back up, and eventually it would come home. And they are now struggling with trying to keep the zero COVID policy idea alive. I mean, Shanghai just ended a 2-month-long lockdown that was very intense, and now they've gone to the neighborhood level with lockdowns instead of citywide lockdowns. They're starting to try and refine their hammer strokes a bit, but they are having much more trouble now than they were when we finished the book. But I'm not surprised in the least that this has happened to them.
So often outcome analysis requires decisions that are made, well, this seemed to be good to do this, but it really takes a long time to really understand how good or bad it was. Now, and the Chinese decisions, it appears to me, there's some merit to them, but right now they're fairly wrong-headed. And the reason for that I would say this is one has to balance the travail the epidemic itself causes. So some people are going to die. Some people may get the so-called long COVID. They may have persisting symptoms. It's certainly not a good thing to have it. I mean, it's not an optimal situation. On the other hand, the cost of the Chinese control mechanisms is just extraordinary, and it's extracted a worldwide cost. Some of the inflation issues that the world faces, there are reasons for that, but the supply is so much of the world's supply of goods over the past several decades has been given to China, that if they close factories or ships don't sail, then there are tremendous shortages. And I think we see that in healthcare goods, things like medical masks or contrast agents. They're in short supply, and just to ask the question, what's happened here? Well, everything is being produced in China because it's cheaper. That's kept the U.S. inflation rates down, and there's a certain vulnerability that happens in the rest of the world depending on Chinese policies. And it seems to me that in the West, there's plenty of squealing that goes on in our system. If we think the government is an error, I mean, there's lots and lots of pushback with government policies in regards to anything, particularly combating the virus, taxes, all kinds of policies that are being assaulted. So if the government is on the wrong foot, it's certainly going to be discussed, and hopefully the government will change. I think it's less so in China. And the government touts the fact that they have such few cases. But one has to ask the question, are they really getting correct numbers? So the numbers that appear from this great nation with 1.4 billion people there, only a few handful of people apparently have it, even though there are eyewitness reports, particularly when the virus originally struck, people were dying on the streets. It would be reasonable to think there's a fair amount of virus out there that's not reported. And so maybe there are restricted policies which are top-down arrangement where the people sort of take it. They don't. There's not too much pushback. Maybe that says the Chinese system is not that great. And I'll continue to make one other point about it. Is their vaccine that they developed is a quite inferior one compared with what the West did, particularly the United States, with a private government partnership that produced this world-saving vaccines. Had this not happened, the devastation of the virus would be unspeakable. It's been bad enough. But you want to comment on the Chinese vaccine, the Russian vaccine? Any comments about that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean the Chinese vaccine is a fairly standard vaccine. I mean, in terms of it requires cultures being drawn. It does not use live virus particles, but it does use viral material, which makes them difficult to standardize and takes a long time to produce. They're cheap, but they're not. You trade quantity for quality at that point. and kind of hope for the best. Now, they are still hitting the 50% effectiveness mark, at least in their earlier trials. We're not sure how well that's held up against recent variants, and it's certainly going to decrease, but 50% is the gold standard for vaccines around the world. We have been blessed comparatively with vaccines that are hitting 75, 85, 90% efficacy, which is almost unheard of for most vaccines in general. The Russian vaccine is a more complicated version of the Chinese vaccine. It's uses specific, it basically genetically edits existing viruses that are harmless to humans to inoculate us with viral material. Its efficacy is also questionable, but it's a little more, it's a little better than the Chinese ones, but it's still heavily shrouded as well in the Russian media blackout that they basically contain. I mean, it's the whole Russian vaccine race had very nationalist vibes to it, which, as we've seen with what's going on in Ukraine, is not surprising with that administration's tone. But calling it Sputnik 5 was a bit on the nose for their race. But they have not done a good job with vaccinating their population. They move very slowly to do it, and its efficacy has been fairly middling comparatively because we don't know the full scale of viral infection in Russia because they've been incredibly reticent to admit anything, but it was pretty overrun by the virus at various points during this phase. Now, the vaccines that the West has been producing comparatively are much better.
Yes.
They're much more expensive, but they're benefiting from years of government research across the board. In the United States, we had BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Agency, which is the biomedical arm of kind of government research that was set up by President George W. Bush. And it had been preparing for something like this for years, been experimenting with all kinds of different types of vaccines and different technologies. So we were starting from a better position technologically than a lot of other countries. So I'm not surprised that once we got the perfect match of public and private mixing with the right level of government funding and private ingenuity, we did get some very good vaccines. And while their efficacy will decrease over time, especially as new variants are created, they have proven quite resilient to infection.
So one of the title of the book, why don't you hold the book up so the many people watching us right now can see this, Harry? That's great. It's
Yes.
That's good. Okay, it's a new chapter in an old war, and the comment is Corona-19 strikes the world order. So one thing that we've observed as we've looked into this issue is the fragility of the world order, how we're all together on our one planet. There are 8 billion people from all kinds of different cultures, histories, ethnicities, and societal structures, and how well has the world order responded? You'd like to think that this great crisis has drawn people closer together. They understand that we have this, the problems can take place in isolated parts of the world and strike everyone, and we have to have some kind of appropriate world health arrangements. We need to understand our connections with other people. You could also make the case that the climate arrangements, which are hard to manage, the global warming, I don't know if the right word is change, but I would say it's warming some. Maybe change has been substituted. But I think you could say it's warming. That makes these viral particles more easier out there. And these pan-epidemics may sweep across the world very readily, and the system needs to be in place to deal with this. And I fear, and I'll ask you to discuss this, the fact that we have centrifugal forces out there. We're erecting boundaries between countries and peoples as opposed to being on the same wavelength. Has this viral attack drawn us closer together or further apart?
It's in some ways it has brought us closer together, I think, as we're all enduring a common threat, but that threat has not been great enough to override our own natural desire to compete for resources when scarcity strikes. The economic crisis that was brought on by this pandemic was, by almost every metric, at least as bad as the Great Depression. In some places worse. And so it has really hit the world writ large very hard and very unequally. And it was the spark that was needed to light a lot of powder kegs around the world. Conflicts that were simmering, conflicts that were already, underway, but which were going to kick into high gear now. These last few years have been really violent comparatively. That we're seeing an upsurge in intrastate conflicts, civil wars, guerrilla actions, that kind of stuff. We've seen more interstate conflicts recently than we previously have for a few years. It has really pushed people to a point of desperation where they need to act against others more than it has brought people together, I think.
Well, let me ask this question. I believe sort of a central point of a lot of what we talk about is our brains. Being a neurosurgeon, I tilted in that direction. But we have a very Neolithic brain. It was carved out of biological matter over thousands of years. It does great for 100,000 years ago. We could kill cave bears and get food and propagate and things would work out. But right now, the brain it has such a violent nature to it that it appears that if any stress happens to our species, we sort of lash out against each other. And particularly if there are economic issues or food shortages or you name it. And so you mentioned some of the I guess you'd almost say, mental illness that's taken place, more suicides, more mass shootings, the relationship between that and the psychological trauma that all of the lockdowns caused and all the fear the virus engendered. Having said that, Russia attacked the Ukraine. Now they obviously have the predisposition to do that. Is there any way to hook up the Russian assault on the Ukraine as some kind of secondary impact of the pan-epidemic? And the fear that was engendered, the anger, the economic difficulties, if you're a decision maker in the state, the people are probably a little upset with you. You have a really inferior vaccine. Additionally, everybody, the life expectancy is bad to start with there. People rarely live, particularly males are dead at 60. Alcoholism is there, all these problems. And so was a leadership response, having gone through this, to lash out at another country and presumably take the mind off the population and some kind of displacement of all this angst to getting it off the table in the war. Comments?
Absolutely. I think that's a perfectly fair assessment. Russia's economic status was beginning to crumble under the pandemic's weight. People were dying in, I think, much higher numbers than we know. Our excess death models that we have definitely suggest that, for sure. There was a lot of anger that had already been simmering for years against Putin's regime. The opposition under Navalny had actually begun to galvanize during the pandemic. And so under times of great domestic duress, like Putin's tactic in particular, has always been foreign adventurism. He did it with Chechnya in the early 2000s. He did it with Georgia in 2008. Anytime there's a question of domestic dissent and it looks like his regime may be threatened, he has always looked for victory abroad to show that he's still the guy, he's still the man who deserves to be in charge, and to remind Russians of his power and of Russia's power. So I think that the invasion of Ukraine was a perfectly natural end result of some of these processes. It was not. Now, the pandemic was not the only cause of this remotely. You can't lay 100% of this at the feet of the pandemic, but it was definitely, I think, an accelerator, a catalyst towards this tragedy that's going on.
Well, now, drawing our attention back to the Bible and the four horsemen of the apocalypse, so one plague is there, and another pale horse, maybe that's death, is war. Mm-hmm. So any kind of shortages or distraction, war goes there, and then along with that, we get hunger, famine. Mm-hmm. So the disruption of food supply is another secondary fact that's out there. So it's said, well, we're blaming everything on you could even say that war has disrupted the plague starts the war disrupts food supply, we get global hunger, millions of people die, and that further destabilizes the earth. So to make the earth a safe place for our descendants in which to live, we have to solve these problems, and I wonder, do we have the apparatus for the world order to really look into these issues, or is nationalism so prevalent now and fear so ubiquitous that people are, they've sort of given up on a world order? Do you have any thoughts on that, Harry?
I'm going to be pessimistic first and then optimistic second. First, no, the world order has no capability of understanding this, and never has, to be honest. Throughout history, I mean, the idea that we have of the United Nations and global governance is it's the latest strain in a very old line of attempts, but international institutions like the UN only have as much power as states are willing to give them. States have always been the primary unit of the international system and always will be. Their relative power may change, but they will still be, I think, the primary unit of that. Nationalism is not really a new thing either in that regard. This is just, I think, that this crisis has shown that most states are just not willing to give any, semblance of a world order enough power to do what really needs to be done. Now, there are still some ways around this. There are, you can make bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements where smaller groups of countries can come together to create new rules, new institutions, new plans, which could help mitigate crises, if not prevent them entirely. But I don't think you're going to see truly global action on this sense. I don't think that NATO for public health would be out of the question at all. In fact, I think that'd be a perfectly reasonable answer to some of these things where you have regional blocks of countries working together to aid each other in the case of public health crises and to share information to prevent cross-border transmission. But you're never going to have a World Health Organization that can actually do what needs to be done.
How about, as we near the end of our little dissertation, what about worldwide vaccinations? There's certainly enough vaccines out there that are really effective to do that, and to vaccinate everyone in the world, which presumably would be useful, and it would also be a mechanism to be ready for the next crisis that comes, just to say, oh, well, it's going to do that, and the amount of money necessary to affect this is not a huge number compared to the world's gross GNP. It doesn't seem, I've heard stories about countries, I'll do this and do that. The U.S. is maybe one of them. But it doesn't seem to be any major events going on right now. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, we early, kind of in the middle of the pandemic, the Biden administration was very vocal about sending out, vaccines to countries, but because at that point there was still a level of scarcity that nobody wanted to promise too much. Nobody wanted to say, oh, well, we'll give you all the vaccines you need, because no one knew how many vaccines they would need. That attitude really never went very far. But you're absolutely right that it would not cost a lot to vaccinate really the entire world. We're talking, billions, not trillions of dollars for these costs. And if the U.S. was smart, this would be where we really need to get to function. China is already way ahead of us in this game. China has been treating their vaccine the way the Soviets treated the AK-47. That it has become a ubiquitous symbol of medical diplomacy during this pandemic for them, and it has really helped them solidify their diplomatic position, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, somewhat in Latin America, and definitely in South Asia as well. And they've been using all these countries as guinea pigs for their own vaccines because their zero COVID policy had meant that there weren't enough cases officially for them to really do good tests. So they were testing all their vaccines on all of these people in all these countries under the guise of helping them. And the U.S. has refused to get its act together and take the vaccines that we have, that we know work, that we know are effective, and actually go out and make a development project out of getting these vaccines there. And it's not just enough to go out and vaccinate people. I mean, we could do all the good PR of having pictures taken and all the soft powers, we call it NIR, of going out, putting shots in people's arms. But if we're not willing to finance the building of facilities which can warehouse vaccines, which can produce vaccines, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, which has very little infrastructure for these kind of things, we're asking for trouble for the next one.
Well, I think it's about time to conclude our little dissertation here, Harry. It's been nice having you here, and I know we're going to keep working, and we have another book is being hashed out. It's in utero now, but it's been good talking to you, and it does emphasize the moral dilemmas that our species faces about what is right and wrong, and fear is out there, war is out there, hunger, distress, anger, hatred, and we have to be aware of these demons and do our best to restrain them. So thank you for being with us tonight, Harry. Good. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Of course.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.